send you. I just sent you, which was the whole story behind it.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Anna Greco. I am the Director of Education, and we are so excited to have Adele Logan Alexander with us tonight. Before we get started, I just want to say a couple of things. As you may have noticed on our opening slide, the book Princess of the Hither Isles is available in our museum shop, and that is available in person as well as online. So please, if you're interested, go ahead and check it out. And a big thank you to Adele, because thanks to her, we do have signed copies available too. Tickets to our annual Antiquarius event are now available. This year's highly anticipated programs are going virtual. We are offering an online antique show, design show, behind the scenes workshops with Eddie Ross and Susan Scully, virtual house tours, a designer panel, and so much more. So please check out all of the details on our website, www.greenwichhistory.org. I also want to thank all of our members for all that they do supporting the Greenwich Historical Society. Your membership supports our programming, and it makes evenings like tonight possible. I'm sure that many of you have become quite savvy with Zoom, but just a few reminders. All of the participants will be muted during the talk, but Adele has offered to answer some questions, and we're asking for those to be submitted through the chat. Right at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little speaking bubble with a chat sign. You can just click on that, and you can submit your question either to everybody or to the Greenwich Historical Society, and I will facilitate those questions at the end of the talk. I would now like to hand the screen over to Honorary Trustee and Chair of the Reimagine the Campus campaign, Peter Malkin, to introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you, Anna. It's a privilege and a pleasure to introduce Dr. Adele Logan Alexander, an accomplished historian, and delighted to welcome her and you to the Greenwich Historical Society as part of the celebration of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment that gave the right to vote in federal elections to, and then through the 14th Amendment to state elections, to all women, citizens of the United States of America. Dr. Alexander earned her PhD and was professor at George Washington University. She is the proud descendant of Adella Hunt Logan, who was the lady principal of the Tuskegee Institute, led famously by Booker T. Washington, and a leading suffragist who experienced both the positive and social discrimination aspects, racial discrimination aspects of the suffrage movement. Dr. Logan is the daughter of Dr. Arthur C. Logan, a cardiologist and chief of Knickerbocker Hospital in Harlem, and the personal physician of Martin Luther King and Duke Ellington. Her husband, my longtime friend, whom I've known for 68 years, Clifford Alexander, was a Harvard classmate, Yale Law graduate, longtime friend, and first African-American Secretary of the Army, appointed by President Carter in 1977. Her children, Elizabeth, who was the poet who read her poem at the first inauguration of President Obama, was head of the Yale Department of Afro-American Studies, and is now president of the Mellon Foundation. Her son, Mark, is the dean of the Law School of Villanova University. She will speak to us about her book, Princess of the Hither Islands, the story of her grandmother, Adella Hunt Logan, I believe having been given the name Princess of the Hither Island by President Teddy Roosevelt, whom she knew. As Anna said at the beginning, the book is available, autographed, for purchase at the gift shop of the Greenwich Historical Society. And now I'm delighted to turn this over to our dear friend, Adele Logan Alexander.
Thank you so much, Peter. It is such a joy to be here at the Greenwich Historical Society, or actually to be here at my home in New York City and talking to people at their homes, wherever they may be. But it's a joy that you and Isabel are part of the Greenwich Society, and that it is because of your invitation that I am actually here today. My sincere thanks also to everybody at the Society for inviting me and for your wonderful patience and flexibility in making this possible. So we are gathered here through the magic of Zoom for me to talk to you about my new book, Princess of the Hither Isles, a Black suffragist story from the Jim Crow South, which is a biographical memoir about my paternal grandmother, whose name was Adella Hunt Logan, and who, of course, is the one for whom I've named. If you've already read the incredibly complete introduction that the Society provided, you already know a good deal, but hopefully I can share something additional and something new about how I came to write it, the slow evolution from concept to article, and finally to the book itself. For me, the story isn't really new at all. So at first I'll share with you a bit about how it happened to come about. In the early 1980s, a young woman named Rosalind Terborg Penn, whom I barely knew at that time, but who over the years became my dear friend, she came to see me because she'd heard that Adella Hunt Logan was my grandmother. At that juncture, Rosalind was working on her PhD dissertation at Howard University, and her topic was African Americans in the women's suffrage movement. She'd come across Adella, become intrigued by her, and wanted to know more about her. She'd heard that I was Adella's granddaughter. Since I'm named for her, that connection was and is hard to deny. At that time, and historically speaking, it wasn't that long ago, virtually no one had ever heard of or even imagined such a thing as Black people and their involvement in the struggle to achieve universal suffrage. No one had ever thought that that was a worthy dissertation subject, but Rosalind did. She became a pioneer in making Black women's history a part of university curricula all across the country. In many ways, I have followed in her footsteps. She told me more than I'd previously known about my grandmother's writings on behalf of women's suffrage, which, while I shared with her what I knew about Adella Hunt Logan's private life, her home, her education, her family, and the like, especially my father, who was her youngest child. Adella's oil portrait by an African-American artist named William Edward Scott, which is on the cover of the book, sequentially had hung in the homes of two of my aunts, then my parents, and then my own, where it remains even now. Well, what I learned that day from Rosalind Terborg Penn haunted me. I became deeply interested in questions about why it was in a time and place, the late 19th and early 20th century American South, when and where virtually everyone believed and almost certainly told her that she and others like her were unworthy of the vote, both because they were not male and because they were not white. But she instead somehow believed in and articulated and wrote vigorously and marched tirelessly on behalf of women's suffrage, and all of that at the start of the 20th century. I remember hearing, probably in childhood, that she'd been a suffragette. I'm nonetheless now insisting on calling those women suffragists, since suffragette suggests to me something miniature, while suffragist implies advocacy and empowerment. And Adella's activities reveal her unqualified advocacy of access to the ballot as a means of empowering women. Armed with new information from Dr. Terborg Penn, I began my own exploration of Adella Hunt Logan's life, which would not only reveal the life itself, but would also radically change my own life. I was able to find little about her in encyclopedias of Black American life and history. Remember, This, of course, was the days before Google searches. Then I traveled to Tuskegee, Alabama, where Adella had spent most of her adult life, and where my father and his siblings, who helped raise me, had been born and raised themselves. From there, I went to Atlanta University, where Adella had been educated, and ultimately to Sparta, Georgia, where she'd been born and grew to adulthood. I was unquestionably a creature of the urban North, so at that point, the rural South was almost completely unknown to me. Miss Magazine now may seem like a relic from the past. Let me forget it is, however, still published in both a paper edition and online. But it's almost impossible for us to realize and recall from our current perspective in 2020 what a tremendous impact Ms. Magazine's arrival had on the publishing scene back in 1972. Its founder, editor and publisher Gloria Steinem became a household name, an icon of the country's new feminism. And I was a young feminist who greatly admired Ms. Steinem, and I greedily gobbled up every issue of her magazine. About a decade after Ms. first appeared on the newsstands and in our mailboxes, I'd found out enough about my grandmother, Adella Hunt Logan, that I was able to write and submit an article to them. And in 1983, the magazine published my first piece about Adella, titled, quote, "How I Discovered My Grandmother and the Truth About Black Women and the Suffrage Movement." In their introduction, the Ms. editors wrote this, and I quote, "Adele Logan Alexander is working on a book-length biography of Adella Hunt Logan." Well, I was indeed working on that biography, but it ultimately took me 26 years to finish. Lest you think that I've done nothing else during the intervening generation, after my visit from Rosalind Terborg Penn and my subsequent curiosity, I became interested in a little known demographic in the antebellum South called free people of color. That inspired me to return to graduate school. Now my children were already headed to grad school themselves at that point. I was in my late 40s at the time and was probably the most nervous, as well as I fear the oldest, new graduate student at Howard University in 1986. I lived in Washington, D.C. in the time. And despite having virtually no personal experience with historically Black colleges and universities, Howard seemed the right place for me to explore this history, as indeed it was. My master's thesis, then my dissertation, was about free women of color. And while I was working on those degrees, I published my first book, Ambiguous Lives, Free Women of Color in Rural Georgia, which was inspired by my investigations into Adella Hunt Logan's early life and that of her female relatives. I ultimately expanded on my work from that pre-emancipation era to provide the background for Princess and the Hither Isles. As I was working on the latter book and teaching, mainly at George Washington University, for 20 or more years, it morphed from being a traditional historic biography into a novel with a first person narrator, then a third person, then back again to the first person. And ultimately, it became the form in which it now appears, that being what I call a historical memoir, biographical memoir. By shaping it that way, I allowed myself some leeway with my modes of presentation. It gave me some editorial space to sidle gently into historic creativity. I've changed a few names, conflated some characters, developed scenes as I believe they unfolded, but cannot be absolutely documented as truth. I also folded in African-American and Native American folklore as I suspect it shaped Adella's life. But I never misrepresented her story. The Greenwich Historical Society has written and provided such a thorough summation of Princess of the Hither Isles in their introduction to my talk that I hesitate to be duplicative here, but if you haven't read it through, let me give you something of a summary of what my book book is about. This is the story, the true story of my paternal grandmother, Adella Hunt Logan. I never knew her because my father, her youngest child, was only 9 years old when she died. Adella had been born during the Civil War in a small town called Sparta in a region known as Middle Georgia. It was, in fact, in the middle of Georgia's plantation belt, which at that time was a wealthy part of the country, wealthy that is in cotton and in human property that's known at that time as slaves. Her family, however, was unusual. Her grandmother, Susan Hunt, the family matriarch, had Native American, white, and Black relatives, and she was not enslaved. She was clearly an extraordinary but uneducated woman who maintained the affection of one of the region's best educated, most influential and affluent men, a lawyer, an elected politician, and a judge named Nathan Sayre. He designed and built one of the region's most celebrated mansions called Pomegranate Hall. It included a private apartment for his family of color. Over the ensuing years, I learned a lot about Judge Sayre and even visited his home, where Susan had held sway in the 1830s and 40s. That's where Adella's mother, Maria Hunt, was born. Because of their mixed racial background on the maternal side and their white heritage on the paternal side, Susan and Nathan's children looked white, although the law designated them as, quote, colored. Susan's younger daughter, Maria, was born in the early 1930s. In 1852, according to the most accurate reading of the facts that I can make, Nathan Sayre himself presided over the ceremony and married his daughter to Henry Hunt, also a white man and also a slaveholder, who came from a prominent family in the same county. Susan and Henry subsequently had 8 children of their own. Excuse me, I had that all wrong. I don't mean to confuse you. Maria and Henry subsequently had 8 children of their own, born from the early 1850s to the late 1870s. My grandmother, Adella, the central protagonist of Princess of the Hither Isles, was their 4th child. She was born in 1863 during the American Civil War, in which her white father served as a Confederate officer. After the war, Adella was first educated at Reconstruction's modest local school for colored children, and also by one of her white cousins, who was a school teacher. Then at 16, she was awarded a scholarship to attend Atlanta University. She also became a licensed teacher in Georgia at that point. Several years later, following her graduation from Atlanta University, she began teaching in a small school in Southwest Georgia, where she was recruited by Booker T. Washington to come to his new Tuskegee Institute in nearby central Alabama. Washington would ultimately become the most famous and the most influential Black person in the country. At Tuskegee, Adella met another young teacher who also looked almost white, named Warren Logan. In 1888, he and Adella married. And over the ensuing 2 decades, Adella bore 9 children. During those years, she not only taught at Tuskegee Institute, served as the school's first librarian, she also wrote extensively. She wrote about suffrage, she wrote about education, she wrote about law, about health and heritage. But she also suffered from a badly infected kidney, which in 1901 resulted in a nephrectomy. That's a kidney removal, which far more than today, was a life-threatening procedure. The youngest of her children was my father, Arthur Logan, and he was born 6 years after that operation. I learned from digging into Adella's revealing correspondence that Arthur definitely was not a welcome baby. Bearing a child at the age of 46 and having only 1 kidney would be a high-risk pregnancy even today, more than a century ago. It would have been almost a death sentence. Nonetheless, both Adella and her child survived. I want to talk a little bit more about Adella's most productive years, those during which she most deeply involved herself in the suffrage movement. I have no doubt that her interest in and susceptibility to such efforts was shaped by her background, supplemented by her intelligence, her excellent education, and her voracious reading. In her early years, she'd been fortunate to have family, friends, and teachers who, in sharp contrast to common practice, apparently did not try to convince her that she was inherently subordinate, either because, as I probably say too often, she was both not male and not white. With Adella, those provocative assumptions clearly empowered her and found in her fertile ground in which to flourish. One of her good friends, a longtime financial supporter of Tuskegee Institute, was a dedicated white suffragist named Emily Howland. Now, if you read the book, you'll find that I've changed her name because I combined several characters to create her. In 1895, Emily Howland encouraged Adella to attend with her the annual conference of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which was Susan B. Anthony's organization, that was meeting in nearby Alexander. That, of course, was a segregated affair, but because she looked white, Adella could attend, but only by concealing her true racial identity, which she did. I can only imagine the stress that such deceit created for her then and over the years. That was also the occasion on which she met Susan B. Anthony herself. Before that time, it seems that Adella's latent feminist inclinations had been suppressed, but the firsthand exposure to the organization's programs and philosophies that week in Atlanta, as well as Anthony's awesome presence itself and her powerful public rhetoric, clearly impressed Adella and moved her to become an advocate of the same cause. At that juncture, and perhaps with Adella's urging, Miss Anthony also addressed the young women at Atlanta University, Adella's alma mater. I was recently excoriated by a Susan B. Anthony advocate who didn't want to accept the presence of any so-called warts on what she viewed as her idol's sterling reputation. I knew that Adella herself profoundly admired Anthony right from the start when they met at the suffrage convention in Atlanta, but I also knew that on several occasions, Anthony had written what in the eyes of most today's critics and historians could be construed as racism. I did not and would not call Anthony a racist, but some of her words and deeds can indeed be considered racist by the standards of our times. Among other things, a few years later, Miss Anthony wrote a common friend who wanted and urged Adella to speak at a national suffrage convention, that she was, as Anthony wrote, almost an ex-slave. That letter from Anthony suggested that Adella should not speak until she was, quote, better educated and better prepared, lest her presence at the convention aggravate or offend some of the politicians whom Anthony and other members of the suffrage movement were wooing to support what became, well over a decade later, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. In light of those words, I should remind you that at the time, Adella already had earned her master's degree at Atlanta University under the tutelage of the brilliant Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, while Anthony herself had what we today designate a solid high school education. But in the meantime, Adella's personal life was not going well. It's been difficult to determine if her health problems that she developed were primarily mental or primarily physical. Almost certainly both the mental and the physical were involved. By any accounts, by the summer of 1915, she was in decidedly poor health on both fronts. When her husband Warren, the vice principal and treasurer of Tuskegee Institute, who was Booker T. Washington's close friend, went off for what they called a boys' week of fishing on Alabama's Gulf Coast, Adella, clearly outraged and unreasonable at what she considered his abandonment of her, started a small fire in his office. She was immediately confined to her home under the watchful care of the school's doctors and nurses. Her desperate act, or cry for attention, further prompted the Institute's top authority, namely Booker T. Washington himself, to arrange for her to be sent to Michigan's Kellogg Sanitarium, one of the country's most renowned health facility. Although its course of treatment seems draconian today, Adella Hunt was clearly, in current parlance, being institutionalized for a period of time. She was also forced, because of the conventions of their era, to pretend that she was a white woman while she was at and under treatment at the Kellogg Institute. About a month after Adella and her oldest daughter, Ruth, who went with her to Michigan, when they arrived at Michigan, they received a telegram containing the shocking news that Booker T. Washington had unexpectedly died at the Institute. They returned immediately to Tuskegee to find the campus deeply in mourning. Booker T. Washington not only had been the school principal, but he was also the most famous and influential African American in the country by far. Adella returned to whisper rumors that in her absence, her husband had become embroiled in a romance with a young teacher at the Institute. She struggled along that fall in her mentally tormented state for a couple of months. I don't know everything that she did in that period, but I do know for sure that on December 10th, 1915, she plunged to her death from the top floor of one of Tuskegee Institute's class buildings. I also know that two of her daughters witnessed that terrifying death spiral. The fall apparently broke her neck, fractured her skull, and both. I know that she lingered, clinging to life and hallucinating for a full day thereafter in Tuskegee's new hospital. Did she imagine that a varied parade of friends and relatives visited her, as I claim in the book? Actually, I have no way of knowing, although it seems possible, even likely. I've nonetheless imagined and used that dramatic scenario to recreate what I believe to be her final hours in a way that seems consistent with her life. In other words, I believe that in some instances, historians have the right, indeed a responsibility, not only to record, but to envision, to interpret, and to explain events as they see them. I've therefore created a number of other likely scenarios for my book. I know, for example, that Adella was in Boston taking her oldest daughter to college in September of 1909, the week before Sigmund Freud made his only public speeches in the United States in nearby Worcester, Massachusetts. I know for sure that Adella and later her children admired Freud and studied his theories. Am I certain that she went to Worcester to hear him that fall? That she presented Dr. Freud with her copy of the classic feminist novel, The Yellow Wallpaper? No, I am not sure at all, but it seems likely, and making that assumption helps a great deal to explain other developments in her life. In the afterword to my book, I write about this using such creative devices. And I quote, "I've done this not only to clarify the story and never to obfuscate the overall and underlying truths as they pertain to my family. I'd not presume to do that if I were reconstructing and recounting someone else's story, but I believe that it is legitimate in retelling my own." I'd like to share the words with which I close the book, which will perhaps reveal some of the things that I've done with Adella's story and why I have done them. But is it true, you still might ask? These are my words from the afterword. Indeed so. Although truth, like beauty, lies in the eyes of the beholder, and Adella Hunt Logan's story may have other beholders who observe the same people, places, and events from their own perspectives and draw different conclusions. This is my family memoir, and I encourage them, as indeed I encourage you, my listeners today to share your stories as well. In closing my talk tonight, I'd like to raise some issues that seem apparent to me and which constitute many of the controversies and complexities which I try to address in Princess of the Isles. The first of these is, what exactly constitutes race? This is a question that historians, political scientists, jurists, anthropologists, and others have been wrestling with for many years. For centuries, American law has incorporated various definitions that are determined and often limited by one's so-called blood. Am I Black and are most of you white because of some legally imposed presumptions about our ancestors? Well, perhaps we are so defined to a certain extent. Lest we forget, it was only in 1967 that U.S. Supreme Court overturned many of our individual states' anti-miscegenation laws in the case of Loving v. Virginia. These long prevailing legal determinations have been complicated and also in some ways clarified by current DNA identification tests, which presumably can determine with some degree of accuracy where our ancestors came from. Perhaps the so-called reality of race has indeed been decided by an arcane combination of law and politics that determine how we should, and I put that should in quotes, be identified. Various laws in various states over time have identified those whom we now usually call African Americans as possessing some percentage or even one drop of so-called Negro blood. In other words, race has been a politically, a legally, and a historically determined aspect of our lives. Here's another thought. In current times, I find, many people of color believe that they have every right culturally to determine race for themselves. No outside source, no laws, practices can or should determine our race for us, or should determine, that is, who we are, and should determine it as a cultural reality. Most, but not all, members of my family, of my birth family, looked white. They were light-skinned, blue-eyed, straight-haired, and most of them proudly identified themselves as Black. The causes that were important to the Black community were their causes. That was their chosen culture. Yes, their race was chosen and maintained more than it was predetermined by law or by practice. But what then about those in my family and other similar families who chose instead to become white? One of Adella's brothers was raised at Tuskegee, lived in her home, then went to Massachusetts where he earned a degree in agricultural studies. He moved to California and for many years he taught in the agricultural extension program at UCal Berkeley. He rarely saw members of his birth family after that, and his wife, sons, friends, neighbors, and his employer never knew that he was anything but the white man he appeared to be. No one at Berkeley ever identified him as a Negro. My father's older brother, that is Adella and Warren Logan's son, did much the same thing. My daughter Elizabeth is a poet, and she wrote this about Paul's story as it came down to her through family lore. She says this: sometimes I think about great uncle Paul, who left Tuskegee, Alabama, to become a forester in Oregon. And in so doing, he became fundamentally white for the rest of his life, except when he traveled without his white right to visit his siblings, now in New York, now in Harlem, USA, just as pale-skinned, as straight-haired, and as blue-eyed as Paul, and yet Black. I remember the torment it caused members of my family when my uncle Paul Logan came to New York in the 1940s, accompanied by his new white wife. He wanted to see his white-looking siblings, but not their somewhat darker-skinned spouses. Such are some of the personal conflicts and the pain that our American history and those legally imposed definitions of race have generated and perpetuated. I also want to mention the significance of color and class within the Black community itself. There is little question in my mind that the overarching hierarchy of color consciousness in a society such as ours, that in many ways is still profoundly racist, can infect Black people as well as whites. In most instances, we lighter-skinned African Americans have been the ones who have achieved higher social status, more education, greater economic advantages. And sometimes, I must admit, we act superior. Nonetheless, I also believe that the chasms between anyone who is Black identified and those who are truly white are far greater and more difficult to overcome than those within our own community, although we are all at the same time integral parts of many larger American communities. And finally, I'd like to raise ever so briefly some of the compound and still controversial issues surrounding gender that I believe Adella Hunt Logan's life suggests. These two remain with us today. She fought and in part died for her beliefs in women's political equality. Our country supposedly has put that issue behind us, but have we really? Why does it remain seemingly impossible for us to amend the US Constitution, which could have been controlled with an Equal Rights Amendment? How could we not amend our Constitution so that all aspects of women's rights become inalienable truths under law? Many continue to argue that no such amendment is necessary because virtually all such rights are protected at the present time by the states. Nonetheless, many states still challenge women's rights to reproductive freedoms, for example. I am almost certain that they will continue to do so. Would my grandmother, Adela, have had 9 children if she'd had a choice? If she herself, and not her husband, had controlled her fertility? Would she have born a 9th child, one that I know she did not want? And yes, that 9th child was indeed my father. When the Supreme Court was deciding Roe v. Wade in the early 60s, I remember seeing a poster featuring an obviously very pregnant young man over the words, "If men got pregnant, abortion would be a sacrament." Well, perhaps not, but at least you get the picture as I see it. In any case, I conceived and wrote Adella's story with many such thoughts in my mind. Yes, I also wanted to share what I thought many years ago and still think is a fascinating family story. And yes, the experiences of Black women in the suffrage movement need to be further examined and explored. But there's more here as well, I think, more about our country's extraordinarily complex history of race, class, gender, and empowerment. And I hope that Princess of the Hither Isles will stimulate you to ponder and ask and demand more answers about these complex questions. And with that, I will turn it back over to Anna, and I hope that I will be able to answer some of your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I just would like to remind everyone that if you do have a question, you are welcome to submit it through the chat, which can be found at the bottom of the screen. There's a little speech bubble and it just says chat on it. So if you click on that, the ability to write a question will pop up on the side of your screen.
Adele, it's Peter. And just what your talk was wonderful, first of all. Thank you so much. Secondly, it is fascinating to me the heights to which Cliff and you have risen. And wonder whether and to what extent you and he have personally experienced racial problems that you feel have either detracted from your accomplishments or energized them to do better than anybody else.
Good question, Peter. I would say energized more than anything else. I think that there's little question in terms of my family. I don't want to speak for Clifford, but I think I can in this instance speak for my husband. Our families had very high expectations for us. We knew that we always were expected to behave better and get better grades and be neater and cleaner than anybody around us. And so that was always the standards to which we were held. And it's hard, but, and it's demanding, but I think that it does and did make us stronger and possibly better people.
We do have a question from Myra. Myra, I'm not sure if you would like to type it or if you would like to just say it, you can.
Thank you, Miss Alexander. I am the biological mother of 2 Black children, and as you can see, I'm white. And I would appreciate any counsel. They're teenagers, not for them so much as for me. I grew up in a white community, very white community. I didn't speak or know a Black person until I went to college. And I repaired that experience right away as I grew into adulthood, and in fact married a Black man as my husband. But I will confess that I feel at sea as a white person in raising my children sometimes in this fraught world. And I thought I would appreciate any remarks you might have about that. I'm sure it applies to so many people.
I think that there are more universalities than differences about raising children, although I do hear very frequently about white women such as you who have questions that they feel they are not prepared to answer. I think that what I would say to you is basically use your own instincts, use your own good judgment, love them as much as you can, and tell them the things that you hear all the time nowadays, that you have to be a little bit more careful about who you are, where you go, what you do, than what young white men might have to face at this point in their lives. But I think that my bottom line would be expose them as much as possible, love them as much as possible, and provide as strong a home and educational background, and if it's yours, a spiritual background as you can.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
You're more than welcome.
We do have one more question from Ari. Ari, do we want to go ahead and ask yours?
Sure. Thank you so much. And thank you for sharing your story and your work. I deeply, sincerely appreciated that. I also just wanted to say that your work and research resonated with me very deeply because of my academic background, the privilege I've enjoyed, and also the ethnic, familial, and racial identities and challenges I've endured. I am wondering how you manage to prioritize your mental health with regards to I guess, identifying your own story and then sharing it, because this is something I've wrestled with, not only in terms of facing the world and outward challenges, but also within my own family. I've had relatives who refuse to acknowledge certain aspects of their heritage or like to ignore it and that sort of thing. And I just wanted to ask you how you've managed it, but also applaud you for your positive outlook and your optimism as opposed to just sort of like resigning yourself.
Well, I sometimes say I don't know whether it was better or worse that I attended graduate school when I was as old as I was. It did give me perspective. It also gave me something in common with my children at that point in my life. But also, for me, there was one factor that was a tremendous plus, and I mentioned it very briefly in my talk. I had grown up in New York City. I had gone to a private school where most of the other students were white. I went to college. I went to Radcliffe College, and although my relatives of the next generation up had all had experiences with historically Black colleges and universities, many of them even beyond Atlanta University and Tuskegee, which I mentioned in my talk. But Howard University was an extraordinary experience for me because I hadn't had it earlier. Going to a university that defined itself as such, that had such a tradition in teaching students and in having professors who were actually of all ethnicities, was something even beyond, well beyond the academic subject of history that was incredibly enriching for me and really made me grow and understand where I came from and where I wanted to go. And I'm not sure if that really addresses the question that you were asking, but I hope it does. And if not, you can clarify.
No, that was lovely. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Anna, I just want to remind everybody that Adele's book with her book plate and signature is available at the gift shop at the Greenwich Historical Society and can be ordered either in person or virtually. Adela, terrific talk. Really, Isabel and I just greatly enjoyed and learned from it, in addition to having read the book.
Thank you, Peter. That means so much to me to hear that. And thank you, Anna, and everybody at this Historical Society for a lovely evening for me.
Thank you. This was such a wonderful talk to have, and I really appreciate you sharing your story and your family's story with us. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.